you, Dean Davis. And thank you for inviting us here and being so nice to us. I think I can speak for my colleagues when I say that it's just been so professional and so warm. And, you know, and sometimes you've worked at a place you can't really go back, right? And I feel very blessed that I can always come back to ISL. So thank you. But yeah, so let me just say a few words about the question of what is critical race theory, and then each of us is going to talk about that from our own perspective. But I'll provide some sort of some general overview on that. So critical race theory is a critique of American jurisprudence, and we ask the question really: if the law is objective, then why does it appear to serve mainly the interest of white people in the U.S., right? So if you go to law school, you're taught that the law is objective, that it is fair, and legal scholars have been raising this question for a long time, especially if you look at legal outcomes in terms of what happens in our court system. So they've raised lots of questions about that. It is also a theory, because it has the term theory in it, so it's used by legal scholars to really examine the persistence of racism in American society, right? It's a theory that is an explanation for why racism exists, right? And so we draw on critical race theory as a framework to help us understand what's happening in a variety of settings, including schools, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's also a method. It's a methodological approach to sort of telling counter stories, using counter narrative as the way to help people understand the conditions facing racially minoritized folks. And so the method that we use often is counter story, and folks will talk about that. CRT has certain core principles. So you can advance to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, go ahead. We believe that, so we believe certain things about the nature of race in the US, right? That it is socially constructed, that it is not biological. I think Chancellor Elrod talked about that, right? That there is no biological basis for race, right? So two Black people can be as biologically dissimilar as a Black person and a white person, right? There is no biological basis for our racial difference. As W.E.B. Du Bois said, it's a matter of skin and bone. So that is a core principle of CRT, right? But we also believe that that race does carry with it a form of psychological wage, right? And there's a piece by Cheryl Harris, a foundational piece that talks about whiteness as property. And what she means by that is that white people possess whiteness and that it has value, right? It accrues value. And if you think that that's a questionable statement, think about what happens, right, when you get ready to sell your house. If I get ready to sell my house and they know that I own it, it is less valuable than if a white person is said to own it. And so there have been experiments done, you've heard about this, right, where a Black family will put photos of white people in their living room and the house suddenly is valued greater. It's also assessed at a higher price. So whiteness has material value attached to it. This idea of the psychological wage, though, is related to, oh, there's my pastor right there. Look at that. Hey, how are you? Okay. This idea of the psychological wage suggests that even if you don't have more money, that whiteness by itself is valuable, right? And so this is what the plantation owners taught the white poor, because there were moments when poor white people recognized that they had things in common with the slaves. And so in order to keep those populations divided, you had to convince poor white people that they were superior to those whom they had actually quite a bit in common with. They were not enslaved, but they certainly did not own anything, and they had no access to material wealth, right? And so what they were taught then is that their whiteness was to be valued, and it made them superior to their to the Black slaves. So this idea of a psychological wage is really significant here because there's been studies done also where they will ask white folks, what would it take for you to trade places with Michael Jordan? And they say, what if we offered you $50 million? And these are not rich people. I think George Lipsitz did this work. And people say, you know what, I wouldn't do it for any amount of money. People understand that even with $50 million, right, that blackness brings with it a set of hardships that they don't want to have to deal with as white folks. And so that, again, that's what we're talking about. And critical race theorists believe that. Race also has economic, social, and political consequences, right? I just talked about what happens when you get ready to sell your house. That's one of many, many examples. But what critical race theorists do is they document those outcomes, right, as they are associated with race and how race impacts our lives in these very, very real ways. And so we use that documentation as the basis for sort of putting forth arguments about the nature of race and racism in America. We also, you can go to the next slide, we also see racism and white supremacy as, you heard the term endemic, right? That it is just part of the system. It is structural because of the way our society was designed. We began as a slave state. 14 out of the 16 first presidents had slaves, right? So this was part of our cultural makeup as a system. And it is embedded very deeply within every facet of our society. Derek Bell talks about racism as permanent because of the way our society was designed and structured. I just mentioned slavery. We could also talk about what happened to Native Indigenous people. Like that. So when you build a nation based on the annihilation of another group, what does that do, right, to the structure of the society? We also believe that racism is intersectional in nature. So you heard the term intersectionality. People sometimes like to think of intersectionality as meaning that we have different identities. We carry these different identities. What Kimberly Crenshaw really wants you to know is that it's not about identity at all. It is about your experience with discrimination, right? And so racism is a form of discrimination. So is sexism. And so Black women or Latinx women or Indigenous women experience sexism and racism at the same time. Feminists of color refer to it as double jeopardy, right? Kimberly Crenshaw refers to it as intersectionality. So all these things are happening and being experienced at the same time. And so intersectionality is an important aspect of critical race theory. Next slide. Oh, there should have been another slide. But the other thing I wanted to mention real quick is this discussion about narratives and counter storytelling, which I talked about earlier as really being central to. And narratives and counter storytelling are also about lifting up the stories and the experiences of people of color and making them central, right? And so critical race theorists is by, for, and about people of color. It doesn't mean that white people can't do critical race theory, but it is race conscious and it is focused on sharing and helping people understand racism from the perspective of people of color. That is very, very critical. The other thing I'll say really quickly is that it is about humanizing us because there's so many forces out there that dehumanize us, right? And so critical race theorists seek to lift racially marginalized people up and to tell their stories in ways that really bring attention to our plight, but also to our assets, right? And views them in that way. So yeah, that's the cover of the new handbook that was mentioned in the bio that I edited with my colleague Adrian Dixon. And critical race theory in education is an offshoot of critical race theory. So critical race theory began in the law, or critical race theory exists in education, exists in the field of education. And it reflects a diverse set of intersectional traditions, including, as you'll hear about, tribal crit, Black crit, Afro-pessimism, Asian crit, queer crit, Black masculinity, Black feminism. So it's very, very interdisciplinary. A lot of the critical race theory and education work also draws on ethnic studies, feminist studies, critical pedagogy, right? And a whole range of different areas. And so you'll also see within critical race theory and education a focus on higher education as an institution, or as a set of institutions. We talked about that this morning. in terms of how that research looks. You'll see, like in my work, I talk about the K-12 classroom, and I use critical race theory as a lens to look at what Black male teachers are doing in their classrooms. You'll see other research in education that looks at issues of methodology, of qualitative methodology or quantitative methodology, and all these things you will find in the book. I should also mention that a lot of the work also focuses on policy analysis, mostly higher ed, but also K-12. There's a lot of discussion about Brown versus the word education and what that really meant, right, for us, and whether that was had the impact that we hope that it would have. Okay, so let's turn now from talking about what is critical race theory to sort of trying to understand the architecture of this current attack on CRT, right? Because there were some questions, Dean Hope, that I think get at this, and so I may answer some of those, but I think that our panelists will have more to share on those things. There are a couple of videos I just want to show you a little snippet of that give you a sense of how this attack is being constructed and why it's so attractive and broadly appealing. I don't know if you can show that first one. Yep. But the right has constructed a broad disinformation campaign that's designed to confuse its electorate and help the progress of this agenda toward increased understanding about the nature of inequality, the nature of racial inequality in particular. Watch real quick. Critical race theory is the problem, not racism, right? And so critical race theory is the reason we have racism, or we have the perception of racism in the first place. And it pits people against each other, so we must speak up. And then what you'll see next, if you were to continue watching that video, you won't, is a whole set of strategies for how you can speak back to your state legislature, to your school board member, and people are doing that. There's legislation being proposed all over the place. We'll talk about that in a second. We can skip the next video. Let's go on to the next slide after that, if you're okay with that, Stephen. It's all right. But what's important to understand is that the right has created a very accessible tool for using critical race theory essentially as a moniker for everything they don't like, right? And here's the source of that. So Christopher Rufo, campaigns like this one really have an architecture to them, right? Mr. Rufo is the architect of this movement against CRT. There's a June issue of the New Yorker that outlines his intentional strategy to confuse the public and to use CRT as a moniker for anything that's progressive. That's the name of the article. Here's a couple of tweets, and there are more tweets that are out there that have come out since then. But here's one that I thought was really amazing. You know, he says, "We have successfully frozen their brand critical race theory into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perception. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. So he said, I'm just attaching a whole bunch of stuff to this that has nothing to do with them. I'm doing it on purpose, right, to scare people. And then this next quote, okay. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the paper and immediately think, critical race theory. We have decodified the term and we will recodify it. So they're redefining it, right? To annex all these ideas, the range of cultural constructions that are unpopular in Americans, right? And so critical race theory in the eyes of the right means everything and nothing, right? All at the same time. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Next slide. So the right is arming its base, right? The Center for Renewing America has provided its electorate with a set of tools they can use to combat the teaching of CRT in their schools. It includes a list of books. My book is on there. It's a dangerous book that you have to watch out for. I shared that on my Facebook page as a badge of honor. It reminds us really of Nazi Germany before they fully began to implement the final solution. And I say that because I spent time in Poland, in Auschwitz, a couple of years ago, and we learned all about the history of the Nazi regime. And it's very similar in terms of just attacking anything that's considered critical. But here's a set of terms that the Center for Renewing America has listed as being essentially the same thing as CRT. Anti-racism, okay, maybe, but not really, right? That has a different genealogical history. Anti-bias treaty, conscious and unconscious bias, critical self-reflection. There are other terms. It won't let you do it. Cultural awareness, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all that's considered CRT now. So DEI is a dangerous concept in the minds of these folks. So watch out, IU. Don't implicit bias. Land acknowledgement is considered CRT. Patriarchy, right? I mean, is it Marxism, restorative justice, social emotional learning is another one I have. There it is. Is it under there? Yeah, there's another one. And so as teachers, we use that as a way to connect with our students, right? But now these people have been told that social emotional learning is CRT. So they're coming into school board meetings. I serve on a school board, by the way, and saying stop doing social emotional learning because that is CRT. So it's just insane. Let's go on to the last slide, and I'm going to let these presenters share. So what you need to understand is that this campaign has led to anti-CRT legislation that has been passed in 24 states, or has been considered in 24 states. I think it's been passed in like 6 or 7. But you know, Indiana, you know, talk to Darrell Heller. He's watching because he suspects that Indiana is going to be lining up to try to do this very soon. That's a teacher in Amy D'Onofrio. She's a teacher in Jacksonville, Florida, who was fired because her mostly Black students asked her to put up a Black Lives Matter flag in her classroom. There was no policy at the time against this, but they fired her anyway. Fortunately, she did win a major lawsuit. Let's go to the next one. That is Matt Hahn. He was fired. He's a teacher in Tennessee. He was fired because he admitted that racism was part of the American fabric. And you should know that professors at the University of Florida and other Florida public universities are also under attack for teaching divisive concepts. They are also been asked to complete an interview or a survey to denote what their political views are, so that they can be, you know, I don't know, scrutinized more heavily by the powers that be. This is happening right now in Florida as a result of this attack I talked about. And the last one I'll show you, is James Whitfield. James Whitfield is the African-American principal. You probably have seen, he's from Texas, and he was forced to resign recently because he said in writing that America has a problem with race. And he said that over a year ago. And so this movement against CRT has very real consequences in the lives of people and educators. And I would say, you know, in the state of Indiana, get activated, reach out to, talk to your legislators now. Don't wait for the legislation to come down the pipe. AAUP is very involved in fighting against this, and so faculty connect with AAUP. A Portland State professor is very involved in leading the national movement against this because it is a limitation of academic freedom. It is a restriction of our free speech, and it is undemocratic. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Lynn. That was very enlightening, and it is great here in the South. Those realizing or not, those views. And but this evening, I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and I would like to ask, and I'll start off with you, Dr. Lynn, and then we can go to your left. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Yes, and I'll be brief. So my research has been in two areas. I have been, I guess, a scholarly activist in the sense of really trying to highlight CRT and what it can bring to the field of education. So you'll find that a lot of my work is basically explaining what CRT is and how beneficial it can be. I've co-edited a number of special issues that brought scholars together to talk about this. And the handbook really, when it was first published in 2013, was an effort to do that, to say, how can this be useful? How can we bring the leading scholars of education together to really have a conversation about this? So that's been a big part of my research. And then the other part has really been studying the work and lives of African American teachers, and specifically African American male teachers who are very interested in the liberation of African American students and who are tied to their communities in valuable and humane ways.
Thank you. Dr. Simpson?
So I want to start with saying just a little bit about myself. I am a Latina scholar. I am a previous high school teacher. I worked for the Chicago Public High School for 8 fantastic years. I have supported mainly Mexican and Puerto Rican communities in Chicago. And so my work is in schools. I am not, and I do not consider myself a critical race theorist. However, my work is rooted in the foundations of that work, right? Without understanding critical race theory, the work that I do, which is centered on students and critical pedagogy and critical literacy and anti-racism and social justice within urban context, would not have the meaning that it has now, right? It would just be the same old thing, right? And so my work is really rooted within an understanding of CRT. And it's also rooted within an understanding of the fact that if inequities did not exist, then we would not have to focus so much on students of color and those inequities, right? And all of that is, I write a lot about literacy because that is my field. I write about urban education and high schools because that is where my heart is and that is where the focus of my work. And I'm also a teacher educator. I work with undergraduate students at the elementary and secondary level, preparing them not to be teachers, but to be critical teachers, right? And that's a really big difference than just becoming a teacher, right? I think that we have to centrally focus the criticality of that.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for having me. Thank you, Dean Davis, for the invitation. To you, South Bend, for being such amazing hosts. I'm really grateful. And thanks to my fellow panelists for allowing me to sit with you I am an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe and a parent of two Indigenous boys, aged 18 and 20. And like Teresa, I'm a former, and Marvin, a former teacher. I was a social studies teacher at Woodrow Wilson High School in Washington, D.C. My academic life, I am trained as an educational anthropologist who sort of came into this really interested in what the experiences of Indigenous college students at elite institutions was like. And my work has evolved since then. I'll say a little bit more about my engagement with CRT, but in 2005, I published this article called Toward Tribal Critical Race Theory, because I was really interested in the ways in which this idea of critical race theory might relate to Native peoples, and that work has continued to evolve. And my current research really thinks about Indigenous knowledge systems. That is, how is it that Indigenous peoples engage the world and are in fact engaged by it, and the ways in which our experiences are mediated by things like land and history. So that's what I'm up to.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a former elementary teacher. I come to this work using a lot of my personal experiences. So I am a transracial adoptee. So talk about a sociological experiment, right? I got to see whiteness firsthand from my adoptive parents. My analyses and my research are on the mono-minority stereotype. I've really come to that work, really identifying it for what it is. It's racist love. It is a divide and conquer mechanism to pit BIPOC communities against one another and to take our eye off the real problem. So my analyses really focus on issues of race and critical race theory, but then also issues of class and intersectionality. And if you haven't seen it on Netflix, there's a series, Colin in Black and White, and it's a very powerful and well done series. I encourage you to watch it. As an adoptee, a lot of triggers for me, and so that's how I come to this work.
So I'm going to look at some of the questions that have been submitted and trying to figure out which ones we've sort of already addressed through the introductions and through the presentation. But I think I want to give you all an opportunity. So you talked a little bit about how CRT is connected to your work, and when you introduced yourself. Do you want to talk a little bit about where it may diverge from the work?
I can definitely say that it doesn't, I don't want to call it diverge because I think it's central to my understanding of what I do, right? But I do not write about the theory. I do not use the theory in my research, but it is foundational to who I am, the interactions that I have with my students, and also definitely rooted in the ways that I consider how I am in spaces with individuals, with the students that are in front of my, the teachers that are in my pre-service classes, right? It really has to do with that. Also, the other thing with regards to, and I hope, David, you're okay with this, I'm really much more interested in kind of like not the divergence, but really the connections that I always draw from this important work. One of the main connections is really thinking about if we do come from an understanding that race always matters, right? And educators have to come up with some frameworks and pedagogies to think, then how do we address some of those things? Well, we started with many important frameworks such as stats and buildings, right? Culturally relevant pedagogies and sustaining pedagogies. We have critical pedagogies. All of those frameworks and understandings really are what drives us to say, so how would we address understandings of inequities in education to prepare teachers to really resist and refuse those things, right? And so my work is always building on those understandings.
So tensions between anti-CRT from parents and board members versus the experts and pedagogical strategists. Can you all talk about the tension that you all have experienced?
I never know if it's wise to go first. With this group, I'm going to take my chance. Whatever I say, I'll say something better. I think fundamentally the video that Professor Lynn showed really begins to get at the tensions. And I think for me, there's something about who frames the terms of the debate. I think Christopher Russo has done actually a remarkable job at suggesting that there's that ideologically critical race theory is somehow bad for children and it's showing up in schools. North Dakota just passed today a law banning the teaching of critical race theory in elementary schools, and that just doesn't happen. It'd be like banning the teaching of brain surgery in elementary schools. And so, but I think that people are so concerned and worried about it. So I think there are a couple of things here that show up for me. Mythologizing this becomes really important and actually demonstrates the need for why an idea and a tool in the theory like critical race theory should exist. In some ways, the initial telling of the myth or the initial telling of the lie isn't the problem. It's each subsequent repetition of it, so that all of a sudden it goes from being myth to truth. And so, again, I think that just sort of gets repeated so that then you hear people say, I don't know what it is. As Professor Lynn said this morning in session, I don't know what it is, but I know that I don't like it. And there is something that is both funny about it, but deadly serious about it because of the material and the social and the cultural consequences of what happened. So for me, in some ways, having to try to define what it is means we are way far behind already. And I think the turn really needs to be to say, what are our values? What do we care about as in a school district, as a society? What kinds of futures do we hope for all of our children in return to? I mean, I actually agree in some ways with the critique, which is let's return to civics, which means we should think seriously about history, we should think seriously about sociology and seriously about philosophy and start digging into the facts about what this country is and isn't, to think seriously about really saying, here are our shared goals for the future of this country and the future of our children, and then start making some decisions based on that rather than engaging in essentially what's been started here as a cultural war. And so how do you begin to move away from the cultural war and say, fundamentally, I care about the current state of society and I care about the future of it by investing in children so that they have what they need in school to be successful, good human beings and great members of society who understand both their rights and their responsibilities.
I'd like to say a few things. Brian got my ideas clear in my head. So one is critical race theory is not taught in preschool to 12th grade. We know that. I actually am looking at some notes here, and I wrote a piece, and I said it was actually doing my PhD is where I acquired the language and the tools and the vocabulary, and that was so helpful for me to become more human. Because when I was a youngster in my adoptive family, I could see, experience, feel, witness, and participate in things that were like, "Whoa, that was racist. That was what just happened there." And it wasn't until I was mentored and featured by folks like Christine Sleater, Gloria Latson-Billings, Tondika Chapman, who are crits, critical multiculturalists who had life experience, that I really started to notice that, hey, I'm being gaslit. What I'm experiencing is real. And it's with that I think right now, the discourse, and discourse is always important. The discourse continues to change, which it, it always does. We had moments of color blindness, post-racialism when Obama was elected, had a black president, and so the language that we use, right, changed. And then we had a president like Trump who ran on this idea of MAGA, Make America Great Again, which is counterintuitive because if white folk want us to transcend and not look back at racism, it happened, move forward. Why are you reminiscing of this halcyon time of when America was great? And if so, then at what point in history was it great? And so those two don't jive, right? So the through line to me is critical race theory is a conflict theory. And to me, it's based on phenomenology. It's based on real life experiences, right, that I've had. And so when you have different perspectives, they'll say identity politics or stop being a snowflake, right? What's the language? Language police, Latinx, you have all of these different terms. Well, those terms are important for society as we're evolving. I'm reading a book by the conservative McWhorter on woke racism. And it's very fascinating how those who are anti-CRT really argue their positionality. And so for me, I've cited Harrison in 2012, who notes, part of the difficulty of interrogating racism is that so many people do not recognize it as a problem, as something that still exists and demands corrective action. After all, we're in the throes of an era of colorblindness and a post-racial movement marked by ideological and legal assaults against policies such as affirmative action. So that's, in my work as an Asian American, the monominority stereotype and the racist love that, honorary whiteness that people throw on, you're so good. You can see that it's racist because they substitute race with culture. They say, oh, it must be the Confucian culture. They just value education. They just work hard, like we're tiger parents, right? Nothing could be further from the truth. And so that's what I was thinking about when Brian spoke.
But so,
Can I just say one quick thing about that? For me, I think one of the interesting things is this, what's happening is that right now CRT, anti-CRT campaigns, which have a lot of money, and they're putting a lot of money into it, they are working to confuse understandings, right? So, and one of the ones that I've been thinking about is schools are always crying for diversity in teachers, yet they do not want to talk about race, right? There's, and I think it speaks to what you were saying, Dr. Hartlep, that there's this confusion around understanding. So what do we want, and where does this CRT movement come into play to make sure that we think one thing, but we do another, right? And I see that in the classrooms that I'm in. So there's this teacher that some of my students are working with, and he's a white male teacher, and he has, in his campus site, he has Black Lives Matter, and he has a lot of other stuff that matters. Yet his classroom that I went into that is full of Black children do worksheets that don't bring in new understandings, their insights, their stories, their experiences. They're incredible right? Fascination in nature and ideas, right? So where do we come in and think about the ways that we work towards moving in a direction that's really important for us, right? And I think it's really important for us to really not get confused with those things that is happening right now with that big movement around anti, CRT.
I'll say too that, we have never really fully reckoned with race in America. And I think when we watched that 8 minutes and 46 seconds of that horrible crime against humanity with George Floyd, the life being snuffed out, I think that was probably one of the first times when we were ready to really get real about race. And there were some people threatened by that. And Christopher Rufo was one of them, but there were many others. Because, I could watch CNN and have news anchors say things about the nature of racism that I actually agree with. And again, I've been doing this work for a long time. And so I thought, something has shifted, right? In the ether, that we were talking about race in a very different way in 2020 when this all happened. And then we're also at the pandemic, so we had a chance to sort of sit and reflect, right, at home, and so on. And so I think the confluence of those factors meant that we were on the precipice of having a very different type of conversation about race, and particularly the role that our institutions, higher education, right, K-12 schools, hospitals, all institutions play in advancing white supremacy in our society. And institutional leaders who are taking responsibility for not only recognizing and acknowledging that, but then doing something about it, right? That's what all that professional development and all these things that people were doing were about. How can we turn this around? So I think we were in the middle of an ideological revolution in this country around race and racism. And so what we are seeing is what has so far been a very successful effort to simply stop that, to turn that around, to make us fearful, and to have us stop talking together, and to definitely stop talking about race. Because America, and I hate to say this, I was thinking about that, I said, should I say that? I will say it. I think that we've gotten this far because we have ignored it, right? It is not only is critical race theory not in the school books, our history is not in the school books. We don't get an honest education, right, as it is, right? And so for them to claim that there's something happening that we know isn't happening is absurd. But again, it is a way to make us fearful. It is a way to halt the progress that I think we're beginning to make, and to continue this tradition of sleeping through the hard stuff, right? And smiling, but we don't really mean it, right? And you secretly hate your neighbor because they're different from you. That's how we live, folks. That's America, right? And so if we're going to change that, we're going to have to sort of fight through this craziness and understand what's really going on. That if we want to really have a brighter future together, we're going to have to work through race.
As you were talking about race, a lot of diverse people have heard the statement, I don't see color. I don't see color. How does that change the process when we don't see color? How does that impact the work that you all are doing from your lens?
So the idea of we don't see color or a colorblind approach, which also, if you really think about it, it's a little bit of a problematic term. It comes from an understanding that in the United States, we do not talk about race. It's a very big taboo, right? And so there is, just like Professor Lynn was talking about, there is this incredible discomfort around really addressing what is going on. And so when we say, or someone says, I don't see color, you hear I treat everyone the same. All of my kids are the same. When you look at the actual, then, like Dr. Hartlep was talking about, the discourse, the language, it's not the same. When you talk about the expectations, it's not the same. When you talk about the, in terms of punishment, it's not the same, right? And so it really falls apart when we say, we have teachers that say, I treat everyone the same, I do not see anything, right? And then we could also add the intersectionality, I do not see the race, I do not see the gender, I do not see the anything, right? It falls apart when we say, so why is it that students are being treated in particular ways with very serious material consequences towards their being, towards their grades, towards everything, right? If we do not see race, then where is it that we're making those differences? Because there is a difference. We're making a difference somewhere. So we got to pinpoint where that is. Right? We have to be really true about the fact that if there's a difference, we're making it from somewhere. Right? And then when you start as scholars, you start looking at the data, you start saying, so all the Black boys are being treated a particular way, right? So could it be that criterion that we're after, right? All of the girls, right, are being scolded about particular ways of acting with boys. Could that be a factor, right? And so the research has constantly showed us that we can say, and also, just in our everyday understandings, right? We can say one thing, and we definitely believe it today. It really is that simple.
I'm always a little bit tripped out when people say to me, I don't care if you're white, black, orange, or polka dotted. Because there aren't orange or polka dotted people. And so it always feels a little bit disingenuous to me to suggest that. And I think that there's something really important when you think about larger societal structures, whether it's educational or legal and justice or health or economic. The empirical data are overwhelmingly demonstrating that there are disparities among races, among gender. And so we can talk about not seeing color, but it does appear that systems and structures do. It does appear that when you begin to look at it over time, that women make, I don't know where the number is now, 17 cents less than men. When you begin to look at what happens with heart health and other kinds of health for Black men, when you look at sort of future economic opportunities for people, when you think about the futures of Black boys in particular classrooms, the data tell us all kinds of things that say there's a problem here. And so for me, that's less about an individual seeing power than it is about structures somehow being built to respond to them and create the conditions where it's problematic. That everyone should have an opportunity to live whatever their fullest life is with as much well-being as humanly possible with it. And so I just think the individual focus on this is a wrong way to think about it. It's got to be what our structures do to people. And then it reframes the conversation for us to say, what might we do to change structures so that everyone has an opportunity to be able to be whatever it is and create a future of their own making, rather than a structure that limits and hinders some and increases opportunity for others.
Young children, come from a background of elementary ed. Young children ask brilliant questions. They're when we beat them up, we beat that out. Their creativity, by the time they're 12th graders, isn't on the test is the only question they're asking. But at a young age, I was asking questions and identifying patterns, and they were societal patterns that I noticed, racial patterns, where did my family choose to live, what churches did we attend or not attend. So it's almost as if race, how we talk about it and or don't talk about it, really directs us where our attention should go. And I would agree with Dr. Grayboy in terms of, racism at the individual level. Certainly we study it and we know a lot about it. We also need to study institutions. And so that's where higher ed, much of my critical CRT work is around counter narratives, experiences that I've had in the copy room, in the hallways of this ivory tower that they call it, right? And so, to me, racism at times has been identified as defined in the way of proximity to premature death. So racism actually leads to premature death. It kills you, whether that be because of racial battle fatigue and heart health and stress, cancer. But also white folks have been, their life expectancy has dropped, something that's been written about in terms of deaths of despair. And so I really would like there to be more understanding of that poor whites have more in common with folks of color, BIPOC folk, than the few wealthy white men at the top of this pyramid scheme. So I would love for the panelists to talk about perhaps, this tenet of white interest convergence and how, these policies do change. And if we win a policy change, why are we still losing the war? We won a few battles, but the war seems like we're not making much ground, 2 steps forward and, 5 back. And so thoughts, panelists, about white interest convergence and maybe its application to your personal and professional lives.
Interesting, 2 steps forward and 4 or 5 steps back. I think Dr. Hartlep's taking our job. That's a fabulous question.
Well, I was thinking about the work of Derek Bach, who's the president of Harvard University, and he talks about the diversity rationale or diversity as a compelling interest, right? And that argument was used as a way to support arguments for affirmative action, that diverse institutions are more successful, they're more profitable, diverse schools graduate more students, right? So diversity is good for us, so to speak. And I think you're right. I think we've known for a long time that the health consequences associated with racism for Black people and other people of color has been dire, right? And it is the reason why you see those health indicators looking the way that they for communities of color. But it is also starting to impact white people, right? So in that sense, our interests do converge. And if we are able to talk through and work through racism and work together more collaboratively as fellow human beings, and we all lead, I think, a more productive life. But I do think that there is a fear around addressing racism. Some of it has to do with the shame associated with it. I mean, if you study slavery, like I've had the opportunity to do in multiple settings, that I studied it as an undergraduate and I studied it again at UCLA, and there's so many things about the institution of slavery that we do not know in terms of how human beings were treated, right? That is just will make you sick to your stomach, some of the things that we experience. And a lot of things you don't see in the movies that you think are awful, it's worse than that, right? And so we have to face those truths because that is what has served as a foundation for who we are today. We carry that pain in our bodies, right? We carry it physically with us. That pain of having our ancestors having been enslaved. But I think those whose ancestors were slave masters carried that pain in their bodies, right? That is also harmful. And if you're anybody in here who's dealt with psychology or any kind of health, knows that you have to work through and confront pain in order to get rid of it and move on.
I have a question. I was just thinking about the college students that are in the room. I'm quite sure many of them are thinking, perhaps, why are we even talking about this? This happened back in your time period. We're okay, you know? I got friends from all types of nationality and diversity. We're open and acceptable to differences. And so why is this topic even critical at this juncture in time?
We are racially illiterate, and I don't think we can move forward and be illiterate. We need to understand how to read race, right? And in order to be able to read race, you need to understand your history. Our children are not going to be effective change agents if they aren't taught the whole truth about our society.
The other thing around that, I think, is this, Dr. Gregory talked about it, it's not about the individuals, right? So it's not the fact that I go to my school of education and I have wonderful Black colleagues. I have two, but it'd be nice to have more. But so I can definitely say, I see diversity. I see kind of, we're moving. The policies and structures are not allowing us to move. They are allowing particular things that, we can kind of use to say it's progress, right? But if you look at the policies and structures, they're all in place. They are still there, right? And also thinking about Professor Lynn's point about interest convergence, this idea about universities, we know for a fact, there's a lot of research around the fact that especially women of color tend to take on more mentorship, more service. We spend more time in terms of devoting time to preparing and our teaching and our students of color, right? There's definitely an invested interest in institutions. If they are going after this diversity initiative, right, it isn't just for the interest of someone that looks like me, right? Of course, a university will have some sort of interest in
I don't know that I can speak to the 18 and 20-year-olds in Indiana and what their experiences are like. I can speak to the 18 and 20-year-old experiences for my own children. One of whom is in college and one of whom is currently in the process of applying to it. And I think that they would say pretty similar things, which is our generation gets this. And then when you start pressing on them a bit about how they understand history and how they understand the social and the health and educational and material consequences of structures, they're less able to talk about that. And so their personal friendships, I think, are all there. I mean, my children are helping me understand all kinds of things that I don't entirely get. Whether it's about social media and the internet, or whether it's about sort of trans issues, where I'm trying to make sense of what's going on with this. So they're really great at being able to do that. At the same time, I think what we don't have necessarily is a shared vocabulary about how to talk about this, both from an individual level, but then thinking, I'm going to just sort of keep pressing on this notion that structurally and institutionally we have to get it. There's a lot of people that will say, well, in your structure, how do you account for someone like Oprah Winfrey? Right? And so she is a complete and total outlier. And there's one of her. And so that's it. And so the way you explain it is there's one of her. And that's it. And so what about everyone else who has talent and drive and a commitment to being excellent in their work, who haven't had that happen, and this is not to disparage Miss Winfrey at all, as much as it is, there's often an individual example that tries to bump up against structural mountains of data that tell us something differently. So for me and for our boys who are in this age, it's really about saying to them, how do you talk about things in a way that demonstrates that there's a literacy to understand the historical and the contemporaneous aspects of this, but also what it can mean for your future as you again get older and enter into the workforce and have these structures that impact you very differently than they might at young.
I think Oprah was adopted too. I think she is. One thing, the question, why do we need to still talk about it for the students in the room? You know, first off, I would agree with Dr. Lynn. Our literacy on the race problem is poor. I mean, we're talking, and then talking also about our indigenous brothers and sisters who were decimated, colonized. So, 1619, thinking of the timeline, we're a young country, and we're still not really out of it because we have the new Jim Crow. So whether it was slavery legalized, chattel slavery, or if it, is now we're throwing folks up in prison, we're still really not out of slavery in that regard. But fascinatingly, going back to white interest convergence, when Tucson, Arizona, years ago had their ethnic studies debacle, what they found were the kids that were taught about this ugly, horrific history, in terms of oppression, they scored higher. Their achievement went through the roof. And that's when the institution shut it down, which is illogical, because if learning outcomes are what drives the purpose of schooling, why did they shut it down? And we know why they shut it down. So I'm thinking we're asking the wrong questions, we're framing it poorly. White folk need to know about racism. It might be killing you prematurely and your causing you issues, because when you dehumanize folk, whether it's implicit or not, you're really not being human yourself. James Baldwin has written extensively on that, about, the inhumanity, who created the Negro, really. And so that's how I would respond to that. A lot of good, rich learning comes from it. And when we don't teach that, another lost generation, and that history is lost. And then it's revisionist history, and it's the blind leading the blind. And we're banning books and we're burning books, and it's actually in a form of an epistemicide, a death of knowledge when we don't do this. And so the radical proposition would be just tell the truth.
I'll say one other thing real quickly. When I was teaching elementary school, and I have sons too, ages 13, 16, and 19, and it is very important to teach young men of color about racism, because otherwise they internalize everything that happens to them. And I saw transformation in my young Black male and Latinx students when they understood that the way that teacher is looking at you, that is not about you, right? The fact that that person is crossing the street because they fear something that they don't even understand, that has nothing to do with you. But all too often what happens is our young men, they take that in, right? I'm scary, I'm dangerous, I'm a threat, and they play that up, right? And it can lead to some very disastrous things. And so when you understand that people's fear of you is not about you, that's liberating, right? But I think also for white people, anti-racist white people get along better with other people of color, right, in the workplace and elsewhere, and there's just a lot less heartache. And I think, again, we have more productive classrooms and more productive, corporate spaces and so on. So I think that ultimately this is good, but I think, again, we have to confront it, and confronting it is hard, but necessary.
There's some empirical evidence that suggests that for students, regardless of what their race is, when they're in diverse experiences and have conversations, meaningful conversations about differences. This is college students in particular. It's a study that came out of with Walter Allen and others out of UCLA. It's that their grade point averages is higher. They score better on things like graduate record exams. They tend to go to graduate school at higher rates. They tend to have longer term economic success. They tend to actually be more involved in civic activities. So both being able to talk about it, but also being able to engage with people who are differently benefits everyone, whether it's students of color or white students, in really important ways that actually strengthen society, not tear it apart. So these myths around the fact that this is divisive, actually the evidence tells us it's the exact opposite of that. So it can be sort of individual pieces about realizing that we can be healthier by understanding that problem and the way in which a teacher is looking at us is this, but it's also true that there are these really good societal benefits for us to be able to have these meaningful conversations and to be able to engage across difference.
I'd like to ask a question. Go ahead.
I just want to say, also, it's really important for us to consider that when we train and we understand that for our teacher education programs, right, we are still training mainly white females to be teachers. When we help them and support them in becoming critical teachers, they are able to truly interpret what their students are saying through their bodies, through their emotions, through their discourse, right? One of the things that I support my teachers, my pre-service teachers, always in thinking about is if your students are in a way resisting, right, or refusing something, you need to look at what you are doing. Are you the one that is really ignoring their incredible insights and understandings? Is your curriculum really just ignoring who they are as human beings? Do you really see them? Or are you really just born as an awful teacher, right? We have to really be clear about what we are doing towards our students of color and how do we take ownership, right? When teachers understand the systemic racist system and they understand the structures, our teachers then do not come with an affront about, wait, what are you saying? They are saying, how am I supporting the system? And how can I stop doing that, right? That's really important, right? And I think Dr. Grego, and I don't know if you brought it up right now, but we were talking earlier, and he said, I'm not interested so much in the person, it really is the system. With my teachers, I'm not talking about them as racist. I'm talking about how do we constantly support the system through our actions, our inactions, our language, our demands for students, or our ignoring of students, right? Or our silence, right? Even silence is really important. If we teach it in that way, my teachers do not have an affront about, wait a minute, she is saying I'm all this. No, they're saying, I don't want to be part of that system. I am claiming that I want to do right and I want to help and I want to move stuff. I want to be part of that system, so I don't want to do those things. That's a really important shift in conversation that is really necessary, right? And that's the work that I constantly am trying to think about. How do I improve thinking through that and working through that with my pre-service teaching?
I'm sorry we love this question so much. But, I had an experience recently, right, where I befriended a white person, and I had a lot of white friends, Hope is one of them, I have many. But, so I'm not saying I don't have a white friend, but I made this friend, and this person was a conservative, right? And what became very clear to me is that in order to remain friends, there was a whole side of myself that I had to sort of cover up, right? They didn't want to hear about the microaggressions and the racist experiences. They didn't want to hear about the kinds of things that are central to who I am. And so that is in itself a microaggression. It's called micro-invalidation, right? Is that when you are in communication with a person of color and you refuse to see their experiences with racism and don't want to talk about it because it's too ugly, it's too, right? And that does harm that person. And so I had to get out of that friendship because I was harming myself, right? And as a mechanism of self-care, I said no more to that kind of relationship. Now I'm giving this person an opportunity to change and say, hey, if you want to change how you understand who I am and what I'm about, then we can make another go at this. But and I'll say this too. I think that part of the reason I stepped out of leadership this year, and part of it is because of the systems that you're talking about, right? And sometimes those systems are so powerful and so strong that even when you're a dean, you don't necessarily have the power to change it, right? People think you have a lot of power and you really don't. You're a manager. And so I serve on the school board now. I serve on my homeowners association. I serve on a hospital board. And I am in community with people in my neighborhood, in the community, talking about these issues, right? And so the same presentation I gave you, I've given to these community groups, and I've been asked to do them over and over again. And just in community is where we need to be. And I think that's where the change is going to happen. It's not going to be, IUSB is not going to change South Bend, right? We're going to have to be in South Bend working with other people to change South Bend. And that's my approach and my strategy. So, but we can't work together if we are invalidating each other's experiences.
I love this question. So I think that this method of counter storytelling is important because it disrupts particular kinds of narratives that people have come to rely on. But there are often those counter narratives that are part of the method of critical race theory, and frankly, tribal critical race theory, are often rooted in individual experiences. And so what does it mean to invalidate someone's experience? What level of violence gets attached to that, unintentionally often, to sort of suggest what you just saw isn't what actually happened? I mean, it's part of what Dr. Hartlep was talking about in terms of feeling gas. I'm not saying I'm speaking for you, but my impression of this notion about what it feels like to be gaslit. So there's an ontological question here about our being. What does it mean to be in the world as an individual who is part of a group and has these structures that then kind of frame the lenses through which we get seen? I think it's really important that these stories get heard, listened to, and then heard so that people can ask questions really out of curiosity. I wonder what this person might be feeling in this. I wonder what that must feel like. And one of the ways you do this is by talking to other people. Fundamentally, it seems to me, for us to be good human beings is to be in relation with other human beings and with the places in which we live. And so these stories are actually opportunities. Dr. Lynn's friend has an opportunity here to better get to know. I mean, imagine the need to suppress who you are, to be in friendship and relationship with people. What kinds of conditions are created to make that a thing? And how might we begin to take seriously this notion about saying, I'm going to sit with some of my discomfort because this challenges the narratives I have in my head about this, and be curious about someone else's experiences and try to make sense of it in that way. It shifts things in remarkable ways when we begin to do that. There's a general feeling among lots of people who will say, oh, I never knew the need for maternity or paternity care until I had a baby. Well, there's a whole bunch of people that have been saying it for a long period of time, or a need for kind of social safety nets in other ways. And I'm not suggesting that's actually a social safety net issue, just to be clear, until someone has an experience. And so how might we begin to have relationships with people that if I hear your experience, I validate it. I think about what kinds of policies I might begin to build around it, rather than waiting for you to have this experience. Would be a lot further along if we sort of engage the world through real curiosity and meaningful relationships.
I 100% agree with that. It made me think about DEI work. Right now, it's sexy to say this DEI plus belonging, but I think it's true. Belonging is a key facet. Faculty that come to a PWI, do they feel like they belong? Do they see themselves? Cluster hiring, having multiple people on campus. It's getting at that notion of community. It also makes me think about, when folks, administrators are hired to do certain work. You talk about stories. I've talked to administrators who, they're brought to campus to do this, or professors that are brought to campus to teach these courses. And then when they do that and do it well, then they're chastised and they don't feel like they belong. It's like, wait a minute, you hired me to do this work, I'm doing it well. And that's an institutional problem, right? And it sets folks, BIPOC folk up for failure. It's a glass cliff, right? That you have to walk the plank, right? And then you start to think, oh, well, if I only did this better, and it's like, no, you did it right. And that's where the community is important, to share stories and learn from those stories.
So, this is the best question.
Well, we were supposed to leave at 8, sure.
Do I have?
No, I'm just kidding.
I just want to. Okay, so one of the things that we also have to be aware of is this idea about dominance over storytelling, right? So there are certain places where we are asked to tell our story in the land. That's a dominant white, very white supremacist idea, right? Tell it when we're able to hear it under certain parameters, such as you're going up for a fellowship, tell me your hardship, right? If I want to tell my hardship in other spaces, we're not comfortable, we want to hear it, we'll push you out of the university, whatever it is, right? So there's this idea around storytelling that is largely constrained and then demanded, right? So we just, I went to part of the tour today, and during a stop at the Charles Black Center, right, this fantastic speakers were telling their story, right, their truth telling. When we do certain tours, right, are we demanding particular stories from particular individuals for particular purposes? When we are having our students apply for fellowships and awards, are we telling them to tell their particular painful story, whether they are ready or want to or not, because it's a demand? Because if not, you're not going to get funded. Right? So there's this really, we have to be very careful about the idea of, as individuals, as for me as a Latina woman, I tell my story when I want to tell my story. Consequences if I stand that ground. And so we have to think about that dominant understanding of the system that says, tell your story, but it's always constrained under particular circumstances.
I just want to say, maybe this will be the last statement. I don't know. We'll see. You got a good panel when they just start laughing. But I was thinking about the politics of comfort, right? That we are, in higher education, we are so deeply invested in. And part of the problem of being a dean is that, I'm pointing with the dean over here, is that your job is to make people feel safe. Well, if you're going to do DEI right, people are not going to feel very comfortable comfortable. And a lot of people, when they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel safe. In fact, people equate comfort with safety, right? And there's a lot of confusion about that. When they hear an idea that disrupts something in their thinking, they feel unsafe, right? And so to do this on a regular basis and have it be an active part of the curriculum, you're going to have a lot of people claiming that they feel unsafe. And what do you do about that, administrators, right? Because there will be major complaints, legal complaints about people feeling unsafe. And yes, when the Latina and African American woman gets up to tell their story and they are evoking the pain of what it felt like to be treated in a particular way, and they're telling it with emotion, that makes people feel unsafe. And so therefore they want to sanction those voices and they want to silence them and tone police them until they have nothing else to say. And so we have to really watch that trend within higher education because it is real and it is very divisive, and I think it has a lot to do with why higher education is so white.
Thank you. Wow. I want to end on the magic wand. I think. I don't know, guys. This might open up another session here, but 3 to 5 years from now, if you had that magic wand, and we're talking about education, educational inclusion, what would it look like? 3 to 5 years from now. Magic wand. We have arrived, we have resolved, we have fixed. What would it look like?
Well, I'll just say, since I talked about comfort, that we become comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And you don't police anybody, you don't write anybody up, you don't deny anybody tenure because they make people uncomfortable. That would be huge in and of itself. And there's a lot of other stuff I think you might have to share.
I would respond very concisely saying that the demographic imperative or the democratic imperative, the mismatch between who teaches and who's taught, right? The overwhelming white teaching core would be on par and would mirror the kids that are being taught. That's at the P12 level. And the same would be for the higher ed level. I would say the professoriate would be much more diverse. And lastly, I would say to the deans in the room that there would be more deans of color and more provosts of color and more presidents of color. Chronicle Pyra just released its latest data, and it's like 80% white men that are university presidents. And then when you look at what Dr. Grayboy said about compensation, you know those C-suite presidents are making much more than female counterparts. So we would need much more female presidents on campuses as well.
I would just say that we actually get to the point where we do admit the race doesn't and I think it will take not longer than 5 years. So.
I'm going to preface my statement by saying I am an optimist and I wake up singing in the morning. Truly, and I do. I roll out of bed and I start singing. And I think this is a 30 or 50 year issue. It's not a 3 or 5 year. Having said that, I think that in 3 to 5 years, working through that discomfort, I think will be a good marker that you can actually have meaningful conversations and sit in some discomfort, but also have a level of understanding about what's next and what kinds of conditions need to be created so that there are more administrators who look a particular way and more teacher core who look a particular way and a teaching core that can actually meet the needs of the children in front of them because they are really interested in their success. I think will be real markers of it. But I think that in 3 to 5 years, like being able to say that race is important, I think, and being able to have stuck in the conversation long enough that it feels better. For anyone who started like an exercise routine, you wake up, you're energetic, and you wake up a day later, especially 2 days later, you're like, I can't move. You just stop. Right, and so the question is, can you keep going through so that those difficult things become easier? It doesn't mean there isn't soreness involved in that. What it means is you start to see the benefits of it. And so in 3 to 5 years, you begin to see some significant benefits from the work if you're willing to hang in there and do it. You have to have great leadership who's willing to stick with you, including board of your chancellor and your provost. And then you've got to have sort of some political acumen to be able to say, we're doing this because it benefits everyone and help people understand why that's in fact true.
So I was joking earlier, but we are at time. I'm very sad because I feel like this will continue and go on, and I just want to express profound gratitude to our experts, panel experts who come here today to help us as we, as a campus and the community, wrestle with these conversations.